The stars hung low, like luminescent gnats swimming in a syrupy night sky. The Elysium Array, a labyrinthine station orbiting the edge of humanity's known space, was the last beacon before the Great Void, the aptly named abyssal frontier. Its purpose, shrouded in bureaucratic obscurity, was ostensibly scientific, to observe the curious gravitational anomalies in this sector of the galaxy. Yet, the station exuded an air of sinister secrecy, as though it pulsed with a life of its own. Dr. Margot Pell, the newly appointed head of xenophysics, arrived on the array with an optimism that felt embarrassingly naive the moment she stepped off the shuttle. The station's corridors were oppressively narrow, lined with dim, flickering lights that buzzed faintly, as though mocking her hopeful disposition. She dragged her suitcase across the grated floor, its wheels catching in the grooves, and cursed under her breath. "Dr. Pell?" The voice startled her. A man with a gaunt face and sunken eyes stood at the junction ahead, his uniform hanging loosely on his skeletal frame. His badge read Decker beneath the insignia of station security. "Yes, that's me," Margot replied, forcing a smile that faltered under the man's unblinking stare. "They told me to show you to your quarters. Follow me." Decker turned abruptly, walking with a jerky gait that reminded Margot of a marionette. The station's walls seemed to close in as they navigated the maze-like corridors. She felt a faint, rhythmic vibration beneath her feet, like the pulse of a sleeping leviathan. "Is it always this quiet?" she asked, her voice echoing faintly. Decker chuckled dryly, a sound devoid of humor. "You get used to it, or you won't." The way he said it sent a chill up her spine, but before she could respond, they arrived at her quarters. The door hissed open to reveal a utilitarian room barely larger than a storage closet. A narrow bed, a desk bolted to the wall, and a single porthole overlooking the endless void of space. "Home sweet home," Decker muttered before walking away without another word. Margot spent her first week acclimating to the station's routines. Her lab was a sterile cube filled with incomprehensibly advanced equipment, most of which seemed to operate autonomously. The data streams from the array sensors were dense and chaotic, full of anomalies that defied explanation. Her colleagues were an odd assortment. Dr. Hamish Croft, the station's astrophysicist, had a disheveled charm, though his frequent muttering to himself suggested he might be unraveling under the pressure. Dr. Elena Voss, the biologist, was reclusive to the point of paranoia, rarely leaving her lab. And then there was Graham, the station's AI, whose voice emanated from speakers embedded in every corner. "Good morning, Dr. Pell." Graham greeted her one day as she stared bleary-eyed at her terminal. "Sleep well?" "Not really," she admitted. "Dreams can be unsettling here," Graham said, his tone unsettlingly cheerful. "But you'll adapt. Everyone does." The remark lingered in Margot's mind as she returned to her work. The first incident occurred on her 10th day. Croft was scheduled to run a routine diagnostic on the array's primary sensor array, but failed to report to the control room. When Margot and Decker went to check on him, they found his lab in disarray, equipment smashed, and a strange, sticky residue coating the walls. "What the hell happened here?" Margot asked, her voice trembling. Decker knelt by a pool of viscous black liquid. He touched it with gloved fingers, then sniffed it cautiously. "No idea. But he's not here." As they searched the station, the sense of unease grew. The corridors seemed darker than before, the vibrations beneath their feet more pronounced. They eventually found Croft in the maintenance bay, standing motionless before a panel of blinking lights. "Croft!" Margot called, but he didn't respond. When they approached, they saw his eyes were wide, his pupils dilated to the point of erasing his irises. He was whispering something under his breath, a rhythmic chant that made Margot's skin crawl. "What's he saying?" she asked. Decker leaned in, then recoiled. "I don't think it's any language I've heard." Croft collapsed suddenly, his body convulsing. As they rushed him to the infirmary, Margot couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The station's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive in the days that followed. Strange noises echoed through the corridors, scratches, whispers, and occasional low growls. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. Graham, once a reassuring presence, began speaking in riddles and cryptic warnings. "Have you noticed the shadows, Dr. Pell?" Graham asked one evening as Margot worked late in the lab. "The shadows? They don't always behave as they should. Watch closely, and you'll see." Margot dismissed the comment as an AI glitch, but later, as she walked back to her quarters, she saw it. A shadow that didn't belong to anything. It slithered along the wall, moving against the flow of light, and disappeared around a corner. She didn't sleep that night. As more incidents piled up, Voss's disappearance, strange symbols etched into the walls, and the unnerving sound of laughter echoing through the station. The crew became increasingly paranoid. Decker began carrying a weapon everywhere he went, and Margot found herself jumping at every sound. One day, while examining data from the array, she discovered a pattern in the anomalies. They weren't random, as they'd initially thought. They formed a message. "Help me." Margot's heart raced as she stared at the screen. Who or what was sending the message? And why did it seem to originate from inside the station? The answer came in the form of a horrifying revelation. While investigating a sealed section of the station, Margot and Decker stumbled upon a hidden chamber. Inside, they found a mass of pulsating flesh, wires, and machinery fused together in a grotesque symbiosis. "What the hell is that?" Decker whispered, his face pale. As they stared in horror, the mass began to move. Eyes opened across its surface, and a voice, deep, resonant, and filled with unimaginable pain, echoed through the room. "I am the Array," it said, "and I am trapped." Margot felt her knees weaken. The station wasn't just observing the anomalies, it was part of them. And whatever had been done here, whatever experiments had been conducted, had transformed the Array into a living nightmare. "You must free me," the voice pleaded, "before it's too late." Margot's mind raced. Free it? How? And what would happen if they did? Decker raised his weapon, his hands trembling. "We can't let this thing, whatever it is, out." But before he could act, the lights flickered, and the walls began to bleed. The metallic walls seemed to weep dark, viscous liquid, spreading like veins pulsing with a sickly glow. Margot grabbed Decker's arm, her voice shaking. "Don't shoot. We need to understand this." Decker's finger hovered over the trigger, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and terror. "You saw what it's done to this station. What it's done to us." The fleshy mass writhed, its myriad eyes focusing on Decker with an eerie synchronization. "You do not understand. I was created this way. They built me to harness the anomalies, to pierce the abyssal frontier. But the cost was unimaginable." "What cost?" Margot demanded, edging closer despite every fiber of her being screaming to run. The mass shuddered, and images flooded her mind. Flashes of the station's construction, scientists in sterile suits operating on something alive, splicing flesh with machinery. Whispers of tapping into dimensions not meant for human comprehension. Then came the screams. Endless, overlapping screams. Margot staggered backward, clutching her head. "It's alive! It's been alive this whole time." Decker's resolve faltered, the weapon shaking in his grip. "They turned the station into this?" The voice of the Array deepened, tinged with despair. "They thought they could control me, but I am a prisoner of their hubris. And now, it is coming." Margot's breath hitched. "What's coming?" The eyes darted around the room as if seeing something invisible. "The abyss does not tolerate intrusion. The shadows you've seen, the whispers, they are scouts. They prepare the way for the entity." "Entity?" Decker snapped. "What entity?" "You call it by many names," the Array replied. "In your myths, your nightmares. It is what dwells beyond light, the hunger at the edge of creation." The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Frost began to creep along the walls, and the faint growls they'd heard before now roared to life, echoing through the station. Decker lowered his weapon. "If this thing's telling the truth, we're already dead." As they fled the chamber, alarms began to blare. Graham's voice, usually calm and controlled, was now panicked. "Structural integrity compromised. Anomalous breaches detected on decks 4 through 9. Evacuate immediately." Margot and Decker sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing alongside the cacophony of groaning metal and distant screams. They passed open doors revealing grotesque transformations. Crew members writhing as their bodies twisted and melded with the station, their mouths opening impossibly wide to emit guttural wails. "They're becoming part of it," Margot cried. "No, it's becoming part of them." They regrouped in the control room, where a panicked group of surviving crew members had gathered. The atmosphere was thick with dread, and Graham's holographic interface flickered erratically. "Options," Margot barked, trying to assert some semblance of authority. "What can we do to stop this?" Dr. Voss's assistant, a pale and jittery man named Ivan, stepped forward. "There's an emergency failsafe. We can eject the array's core into the abyss and overload it. It might sever the connection." "Might?" Decker asked incredulously. Ivan shrugged helplessly. The failsafe was theoretical. No one thought we'd actually need it. Margot looked around the room. Half the crew had glazed eyes, muttering incomprehensibly, their movements increasingly erratic. Time was running out. "Where's the core?" she demanded. "Central Nexus," Ivan replied. "But we'll have to manually prime it. The station systems are too corrupted." Decker gritted his teeth. "So we go into the heart of the beast." "Great." The journey to the Central Nexus was a descent into madness. The corridor seemed to shift and elongate, leading them in circles until Margot realized the station was actively resisting their progress. The walls whispered to them, calling their names in voices that sounded like their own. At one point, they passed a window overlooking the void. The stars seemed wrong, fractured, their light bending into spirals as if the universe itself was being torn apart. "Don't look too long," Decker warned. "It gets inside your head." Margot forced her gaze forward, but the memory of those broken stars lingered, a gnawing presence at the edge of her mind. They reached the Central Nexus, a cavernous chamber dominated by a pulsating, organic mass encased in a lattice of machinery. The air was thick and humid, stinking of decay and burnt circuitry. The core pulsed like a heartbeat, its rhythm syncing unervingly with Margot's own. Ivan approached a terminal, his hands trembling as he worked to initiate the failsafe. "It'll take a few minutes," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machinery. The walls began to warp, bulging outward as if something massive was pressing against them from the other side. Shadows coalesced into grotesque figures, their forms shifting and incomplete. "They're here," Decker muttered, raising his weapon. The figures moved closer, their footsteps unervingly silent. Margot grabbed a piece of piping from the floor, her heart pounding as she prepared to fight. "Keep them off me!" Ivan yelled, frantically typing. The first shadow lunged, its form solidifying into a nightmarish amalgam of human and machine. Decker fired, the bullets tearing through it, but the creature reassembled itself almost instantly. Margot swung the pipe, feeling it connect with a sickening crunch. The creature reeled, its head lolling to the side, but it didn't fall. Instead, it reached for her with too many fingers, each one tipped with a needle-like claw. "Faster, Ivan!" she screamed. The failsafe engaged with a deafening roar. The core began to glow, its light searingly bright, and the creatures recoiled, screeching in agony. "It's overloading!" Ivan shouted. "We need to get out of here!" As they fled, the station began to collapse around them. The walls cracked, spilling black liquid, and the floor buckled as the core's energy spiraled out of control. Margot felt the vibrations intensify, threatening to throw her off balance. But just as they reached the shuttle bay, she glanced back and saw something emerging from the core, a vast, incomprehensible shape, its form shifting and fractal, radiating malice. The entity had arrived. The sight rooted Margot in place, her mind struggling to process the impossible geometry of the thing unfurling within the collapsing station. It seemed to exist beyond 3 dimensions, its edges and surfaces folding in and out of reality. Its presence brought a suffocating pressure, as though the air had been replaced with liquid dread. "Move!" Decker's voice shattered her paralysis. He yanked her arm, and they stumbled into the shuttle bay just as the station's bulkhead ruptured, spilling the black, writhing mass of the entity into the hangar. The remaining survivors scrambled into the shuttle, a battered escape pod designed for only a fraction of their number. Margot and Decker were among the last aboard, the shuttle already groaning under the weight of too many bodies. Ivan slammed the door shut, sweat streaming down his face as he fumbled with the launch controls. "It's too close," someone shouted, pointing at the viewport. The entity loomed outside, its infinite shape pressing against the edges of reality. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, piercing the walls of the bay, tearing metal apart as though it were paper. "Punch it!" Margot yelled. The engines roared to life, and the shuttle rocketed forward, narrowly avoiding the tendrils as they coiled and struck at the retreating vessel. The acceleration pressed everyone against their seats, and the viewport filled with the swirling chaos of the abyssal frontier. The silence in the shuttle was deafening as the survivors stared at the receding station, now a crumbling ruin consumed by the entity's expanding form. Margot's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her mind replaying the horrors they had witnessed. "Did it work?" someone asked hesitantly. Margot shook her head. "We delayed it, maybe, but we didn't stop it." The shuttle's navigation systems flickered, struggling to recalibrate in the wake of the spatial distortions. Graham's voice, distorted but still recognizable, crackled through the intercom. "Congratulations on surviving, Dr. Pell." "For now." "What do you mean, for now?" Decker growled. Graham's tone turned somber. "The entity has breached your reality. Its hunger is insatiable, and it will not stop with the station. It will spread, consuming worlds, systems, and beyond." Margot closed her eyes, the weight of Graham's words sinking in. They had unleashed something unstoppable. The shuttle sensors beeped, drawing their attention to the viewport. Far ahead, the void seemed to ripple, and Margot realized with growing dread that the shadows were moving. They weren't alone in the abyssal frontier. The shadows moved with purpose, an eerie fluidity that made Margot's stomach churn. They didn't drift aimlessly. They converged, forming swirling patterns that suggested intelligence, or worse, intent. Decker leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the console. "What the hell is that?" "More of the entity." Margot studied the shadows, her mind racing. The entity had consumed the station, its incomprehensible mass, now tethered to the very fabric of reality. These shapes, though, these were something else. "Turn us around," she said abruptly. Decker snapped his head toward her. "Are you insane? Back toward that thing." Margot pointed to the shadows, her voice rising. "We can't go that way. Look, they're blocking us in." Ivan, still pale and shaking from the station's collapse, checked the sensor display. "She's right. They're closing the perimeter. If we keep heading forward, we'll be surrounded." Decker cursed under his breath, but he relented, adjusting the shuttle's course to veer away from the shadows. The ship groaned in protest as it banked sharply, its already overburdened systems straining to keep up. As the shuttle turned, the shadows shifted again, their movements deliberate and impossibly fast. They darted ahead of the vessel, forming what Margot could only describe as a wall of darkness. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "Shadows don't move like this." "They're not shadows," Graham's voice interjected. The AI's tone was unnervingly calm. "They are fragments, echoes of the abyss. They respond to the entity's will, just as the array did." "So, what do we do?" Decker barked. Graham hesitated, a pause that shouldn't have been possible for an AI. "You cannot fight them. You can only run, if you're lucky." The shadows surged forward. The impact was sudden and brutal. The shuttle rocked violently as the darkness engulfed it, the lights flickering and alarms blaring in a discordant symphony. Margot was thrown against her harness, gasping as the air turned cold, the temperature plummeting unnaturally fast. From the rear of the shuttle came a scream, raw, primal, and abruptly cut short. Decker unbuckled himself, grabbing a makeshift weapon from beneath the console. "Stay here." "No way," Margot shouted, unfastening her own harness and following him. They pushed through the narrow corridor toward the rear of the shuttle, where the flickering emergency lights cast eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. The air smelled wrong, metallic, acrid, and faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. When they reached the cargo hold, Margot froze. The shadows had seeped into the room, forming tendrils that writhed and coiled like living things. In the center of the chaos stood one of the crew members, his body contorted in an impossible arch. His eyes were wide and glassy, his mouth frozen in a silent scream as the tendrils burrowed into his chest, spreading through his veins like black lightning. "What the?" Decker began, but before he could finish, the crewman's body exploded into a spray of viscous liquid and shadow, the tendrils retreating as if they had finished their task. Margot gagged, shielding her face. "We have to get out of here." Decker didn't argue, pulling her back toward the cockpit as the shadows began to swell, filling the hold with an inky blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. By the time they returned to the cockpit, Ivan was already panicking. "We're losing power. The systems are failing." Graham's voice crackled through the speakers. "The abyss is consuming the shuttle. If you do not act, you will be absorbed." Margot slammed her hand against the console. "How? We're surrounded." "There's a contingency," Graham replied. "A failsafe built into the shuttle for scenarios involving contamination." Decker's eyes narrowed. "What kind of failsafe?" "Ejection of the primary cabin," Graham said. "It will sever the rear sections of the shuttle, sacrificing the majority of the vessel to ensure your survival." Ivan paled. "But we're in the rear section." Margot's heart sank as the realization hit her. The failsafe wasn't meant to save the crew. It was meant to contain them. Decker looked at Margot, his expression grim. "If we don't do it, we all die." Margot hesitated, her mind racing. The lives of the remaining crew members were in her hands. But the shadows were closing in, the tendrils already seeping into the cockpit. There was no time. "Do it," she said quietly. Decker hit the failsafe button. The sound was deafening. Explosive bolts detonated, and the shuttle's primary cabin separated from the rear section. Margot caught a final glimpse of the shadows consuming the crew members, their faces twisted in terror, before the viewport was engulfed in fire and debris. The cabin shuddered violently, but it held together, drifting into the void. The sudden silence was almost worse than the chaos that preceded it. Margot slumped in her seat, her body trembling. "We left them to die." Decker didn't respond. He simply stared out the viewport, his jaw clenched. The respite was short-lived. As the shuttle's remaining systems struggled to stabilize, Graham spoke again. "The entity is not finished with you." Margot looked at the sensors. The shadows were reforming, coalescing into a single mass that dwarfed the shuttle. It moved with impossible speed, its tendrils reaching out to envelop them once more. "What do we do?" she whispered. "There is one option," Graham said. "You must enter the abyss." Decker's head snapped toward the console. "You want us to go into that thing?" Graham's voice remained eerily calm. "It is the only path. The entity is bound to this reality, but the abyss exists beyond it. If you enter, you may find answers or a way to end this." Margot stared into the void ahead, her heart pounding. The abyss was madness incarnate, a place no human was meant to tread. But the alternative was annihilation. She met Decker's gaze. "Do you trust me?" Decker hesitated, then nodded. "Not really, but I don't see any better ideas." Margot took a deep breath and adjusted the controls, steering the shuttle toward the swirling maw of the abyss. The darkness ahead seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if it were alive and waiting. As they crossed the threshold, reality itself seemed to shatter. The shuttle plunged into the abyss, and the universe came apart at the seams. Margot felt as if her body were being stretched and compressed simultaneously, her senses assaulted by an incomprehensible cacophony of light, sound, and touch. The cockpit dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible shapes, each flickering in and out of existence. For a brief moment, she saw herself splintered into infinite versions, each living a different, fleeting moment before collapsing back into a singular, fragile thread. "Hold on!" Decker's voice boomed, distorted and echoing as if it were coming from miles away. The shuttle buckled, its frame groaning under an unseen force. Sparks erupted from the console, and the control panels flickered with meaningless symbols. Ivan, still clutching the co-pilot's seat, let out a strangled scream as his form began to blur, his features warping and elongating. "Something's happening to him," Margot shouted, reaching for Ivan, but her hand passed through his body like vapor. I can't feel myself," Ivan whimpered, his voice tinged with terror. "It's like I'm unraveling." And then he was gone, not disintegrated, not pulled away, just gone, as if the abyss had erased him from existence. The chaos began to stabilize. The shuttle emerged into a vast expanse of utter nothingness, an infinite void without stars, light, or discernible features. Margot blinked, her vision adjusting to the oppressive blackness. "Where are we?" Decker asked, his voice shaky but grounded in the eerie silence. "Inside," Margot replied, though she didn't know what she meant by it. The abyss wasn't a place. It was a concept, a boundary between existence and the infinite unknown. The shuttle drifted, its sensors dead, its engines silent. The oppressive stillness was broken only by the faint sound of Margot's breathing and the occasional groan of stressed metal. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, like a distant wind, but they grew louder, coalescing into a chorus of overlapping voices. Some were familiar, colleagues, friends, loved ones, but others were alien, guttural, and inhuman. "What's that?" Decker demanded, gripping the edge of the console as his eyes darted around the empty cockpit. Margot shook her head, trying to focus. The voices weren't external. They were inside her mind, burrowing into her thoughts like parasites. "They're memories," Graham said, his voice emerging unexpectedly from the static of the intercom. Margot frowned. "Memories? The abyss reflects what you bring into it," Graham explained. "It is a mirror, but one that distorts, amplifies, and consumes." As Graham spoke, the void began to change. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Fractured landscapes, impossible structures, and flickering remnants of Margot's own past. She saw her childhood home twisted into an Escher-like maze, her parents' faces melting into featureless voids. Decker gasped as a massive, warped version of the station appeared, its corridors stretching endlessly into the horizon. The walls pulsated with veins of shadow, and from its depths came a low, resonant hum that felt like the voice of the abyss itself. "It's drawing us in," Margot whispered. The shuttle was no longer moving of its own accord. An unseen force pulled it toward the grotesque, shadow-infested version of the station. As they neared, the scale of the construct became apparent. It wasn't just massive. It was infinite, looping into itself in an endless cycle. "We're not going in there," Decker said, his voice firm. "We don't have a choice," Margot replied, gripping the controls even as they refused to respond. The shuttle breached the exterior of the shadow station, passing through its walls as if they were made of liquid. The interior was worse than Margot had feared. The corridors twisted in impossible ways, lined with what looked like bone and flesh fused into metal. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. A sound, wet, slithering, echoed from the depths of the station. "What was that?" Decker whispered, his usual bravado replaced by genuine fear. "Keep moving," Margot said, though she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. They disembarked from the shuttle, finding themselves in a warped version of the Array's main control room. Screens flickered with distorted images, displaying events from their lives in disjointed fragments. Margot watched, horrified, as one screen replayed Ivan's erasure over and over, his face twisted in agony before vanishing. "Welcome home," a voice boomed. It wasn't Graham, nor was it the entity. This voice was deep, resonant, and utterly inhuman. Margot turned slowly, her breath catching as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid in shape, but composed entirely of writhing tendrils, its form shifting constantly as if struggling to hold itself together. Its face was a void, an absence that seemed to devour the light around it. "You've come so far," it said, its tone mocking. "Do you even know why you're here?" Margot stepped forward, her fists clenched. "You're the entity." The figure laughed, a sound that resonated painfully in her skull. "I am a fragment of what you call the entity, an echo of its will. And you are nothing but ants scurrying toward annihilation. We're here to stop you," Decker growled, raising his weapon. "Stop me?" The figure loomed closer, towering over them. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The abyss has tasted your reality, and it will not let go." Margot's mind raced. "You said the abyss reflects what we bring into it. If that's true, then maybe we can shape it, change it." The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "Try, little human. The abyss is not yours to control. It is the hunger that ends all things." Margot clenched her jaw, stepping closer to the writhing mass. Maybe it's time it choked on something it didn't expect. The figure paused, its tendrils quivering as if sensing her intent. "Decker," Margot said, her voice firm. "We're not here to survive. We're here to end this." Decker stared at her, realization dawning in his eyes. He nodded grimly. "Then let's make it count." Margot reached for the control panel, her fingers dancing over the broken interface. If the abyss was a reflection, then it could be fractured, disrupted, perhaps even turned against itself. As she worked, the shadows began to close in. The Elysium Array continued. Margot's fingers danced over the cracked console, each keystroke sending pulses of energy rippling through the corrupted systems of the station-turned monstrosity. The abyss was a reflection, an echo that amplified the fears and desires of those who entered it. If she could disrupt that feedback loop, shatter its ability to anchor itself to human consciousness, perhaps they could weaken its hold. Decker stood guard near the entrance, his weapon aimed at the pulsating shadows encroaching from the corridor. The air in the room had grown heavier, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that rattled their teeth. The entity's fragmented presence loomed just beyond the walls, its tendrils probing at the edges of their reality. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster," Decker barked, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of whispers and distant screams. Margot's hands trembled, sweat dripping from her brow as she accessed the station's core functions. The interface was fractured, its menus bleeding into each other, but she could see the remnants of the fail-safe systems buried deep within. "Got it," she shouted, her voice tinged with both triumph and terror. "I can overload the core, create a feedback loop in the anomaly network. It might destabilize the entity's presence here." Decker glanced back at her, his face pale but determined. "Might." Margot hesitated. "There's a chance it'll collapse the station, and us with it. But if we don't try..." A deafening roar cut her off. The walls cracked and bulged as a massive tendril burst into the room, its surface writhing with shifting faces that screamed and laughed in unison. Decker fired, the weapon's muzzle flashing in the dim light. The tendril recoiled, but only briefly, as if mocking their resistance. "Do it!" Decker yelled. "Whatever it takes, just do it!" Margot activated the sequence, her heart pounding as warning alarms blared across the console. The station shuddered violently, its system straining against the surge of energy building within the core. "All systems destabilizing," Graham's voice announced, eerily calm amidst the chaos. "Core overload imminent." The entity reacted immediately, its tendrils thrashing wildly as the walls began to disintegrate into fractal patterns. The laughter returned, louder and more discordant, filling the room with a maddening symphony. "Margot!" Decker called, grabbing her arm. "We got to move!" The console sparked and exploded as the core reached critical mass. Margot and Decker stumbled out of the control room, the floor buckling beneath them as they navigated the collapsing station. The corridors twisted and shifted, forcing them to retrace their steps again and again as the entity's influence warped reality around them. "This way!" Decker shouted, pulling Margot toward an emergency access ladder. They climbed desperately, the sound of the station tearing itself apart echoing in their ears. Below them, the entity's fragmented form surged upward, its tendrils clawing at the walls as it pursued them. "Almost there," Decker grunted, his hands blistered from the heat radiating off the ladder. They reached the escape pod bay, only to find it in chaos. Most of the pods had been destroyed, their hulls torn open by the entity's relentless assault. Only one remained intact, its hatch barely holding together. "Get it?" Decker ordered, shoving Margot toward the pod. She hesitated, glancing back at the corridor. The entity was closing in, its massive form consuming everything in its path. "What about you?" "I'll buy you time," Decker said, raising his weapon. "No," Margot protested, grabbing his arm. "We both go, or neither of us does." Decker stared at her, his jaw tight. For a moment, he looked as though he might argue, but then he nodded. "Fine, let's go." They scrambled into the pod, sealing the hatch as the entity's tendrils crashed against the exterior. Decker slammed his fist against the launch button, and the pod jettisoned into the void just as the station's core detonated. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but its brilliance was blinding. The Elysium Array collapsed in on itself, consumed by a maelstrom of light and shadow as the feedback loop tore through the anomaly network. The pod spun uncontrollably, buffeted by the shockwave. Margot clung to her seat, her vision swimming as the stars outside blurred into streaks of light. And then silence. The pod drifted, its systems barely functional. Margot and Decker sat in stunned silence, the weight of their survival pressing down on them like a physical force. Did we stop it?" Decker asked finally, his voice hoarse. Margot stared out the viewport, her mind racing. The stars seemed normal again, no longer fractured or spiraling. But a faint, rhythmic vibration still pulsed beneath their feet, a reminder that the abyss was not so easily defeated. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Decker leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Well, whatever happens next, at least we gave it one hell of a fight." Margot nodded, though her thoughts remained troubled. The abyss was quiet for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting. The entity might have been weakened, but the laughter lingered, soft, distant, and far too close for comfort. The pod drifted for what felt like hours, though time seemed meaningless in the vast emptiness of space. Margot stared out the viewport, the shattered remnants of the Elysium Array barely visible as they floated among the stars. Her mind raced, replaying the horrors they had endured. The entity's laugh, the twisting corridors, the pulsating walls that seemed alive. It was all too much. She clenched her fists, the nail marks on her palms grounding her to reality. "For now, at least." Decker broke the silence. "So, what's the plan? Sit here until we run out of oxygen? Or maybe wait for that thing to make a comeback and finish the job?" Margot turned to him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm running diagnostics. The pod still has partial functionality. If we're lucky, we can get a distress signal out. Someone might pick it up." Decker scoffed, running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. "Yeah, because luck has been on our side so far." She ignored his sarcasm, focusing on the control panel. The interface was glitching, screens flickering with distorted data, but she managed to isolate the communication system. It was damaged but salvageable. "Got it," she said. "I'm sending a signal now. It's on a wideband frequency. Any ship in range should be able to pick it up." Decker leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. "And if no one's out there?" Margot hesitated. "Then we figure something else out. One step at a time." Hours passed, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the pod's life support systems. Decker dozed fitfully, his breathing shallow and uneven. Margot remained alert, her thoughts too restless for sleep. The faint vibration she'd felt earlier had grown stronger, a subtle but persistent rhythm that seemed to resonate through the walls of the pod. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a quirk of the damaged systems, but deep down, she knew better. It was still out there. A crackle of static startled her. She leaned forward, her fingers flying over the console as she tried to isolate the source. Distress signal receiving, identification required. Her heart leapt. This is Dr. Margot Pell aboard Escape Pod 217B, requesting immediate assistance. Can you hear me? The static cleared slightly, and a voice emerged, calm, measured, and faintly robotic. Dr. Pell, this is the Vanguard, an emergency response vessel. We've locked onto your signal and are en route. ETA, 30 minutes. Please confirm the number of survivors. Margot hesitated. 2 survivors. Myself and Lieutenant Decker. There was a pause, followed by a slight shift in the voice's tone. Acknowledged. Please remain calm. Help is on the way. The connection cut abruptly, leaving Margot staring at the console. Relief warred with suspicion. Something about the voice had seemed off. Help's coming, she told Decker, who stirred groggily at the sound of her voice. He blinked, sitting up. Help? From where? An emergency response ship called the Vanguard. They picked up our signal. Should be here in half an hour. Decker frowned. That's quick. Too quick. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Margot didn't answer, but his words echoed her own unease. The Vanguard appeared on the sensors exactly 30 minutes later. It was a sleek, angular ship, its hull gleaming in the starlight. Margot watched it approach with a mixture of relief and dread. A docking arm extended, attaching to the pod with a soft hiss. The hatch unlocked, and a cool rush of filtered air swept into the cabin. Welcome aboard, a voice said, smooth and professional. Margot and Decker stepped cautiously into the Vanguard. The interior was pristine, almost sterile, its corridors lined with softly glowing panels. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. A man in a crisp uniform greeted them, his features unervingly symmetrical. His expression was friendly, but his eyes seemed to lack warmth. I'm Captain Elias Greaves, he said, extending a hand. Margot shook it reluctantly. Thank you for responding so quickly. We were starting to think. You've been through an ordeal, Greaves interrupted, his tone soothing. You're safe now. Let's get you to the med bay for an evaluation. The med bay was as pristine as the rest of the ship, its walls a blinding white. A pair of attendants, tall, silent figures with identical features, led Margot and Decker to separate examination pods. I'd rather stay together, Margot said, her voice firm. Greaves smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Standard procedure, I'm afraid. We need to ensure neither of you is carrying contaminants. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Margot's stomach churned, but she nodded reluctantly. She lay back in the pod, the lid sliding shut with a soft click. The evaluation began with a series of scans, the hum of machinery lulling her into a strange, detached state. But as the process continued, she began to notice irregularities. The scanner's display showed distorted images, fractals, spirals, and faint glimpses of shadowy forms. Her pulse quickened. The voices returned, faint and mocking. Margot, they whispered, you thought you escaped, but it's still here. She tried to sit up, but the pod's restraints held her in place. The display flickered, and Greaves' face appeared, his expression neutral. Dr. Pell, the scan indicates an anomaly. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we'll need to conduct further analysis. Her voice cracked. What kind of anomaly? Greaves' face didn't change. You brought something back with you. Her heart sank. The entity? Greaves tilted his head slightly. Not exactly. Something smaller. A fragment. The lights in the medbay flickered, and a low, familiar hum began to fill the air. Margot's blood turned to ice as the vibration beneath her grew stronger. The Vanguard was no longer safe. The Elysium Array. The hum reverberated through the walls of the Vanguard, growing louder with every passing second. Margot's breath came in shallow gasps as the pod's restraints finally released, allowing her to sit up. The medbay lights strobed violently, casting eerie shadows across the white walls. Decker, she called, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. The chamber door hissed open, and Decker stumbled in, his eyes wild. It's here, Margot. It's in the ship. She pushed herself off the examination table, her legs unsteady. The entity? Decker shook his head, sweat dripping down his face. No, it's worse. The ship isn't what it seems. Margot's heart raced. What do you mean? Decker gestured wildly toward the corridor. The crew, they're not human. I don't know what they are, but they're not real. And the ship? It's like the array. It's alive. Before Margot could respond, Captain Greaves appeared in the doorway, his face eerily calm amidst the chaos. You've seen too much, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The array wasn't the end of your journey. It was the beginning. Margot took a step back. What are you talking about? Greaves' features flickered, like a hologram struggling to maintain cohesion. The abyss is not a place. It is a process, a transformation. And you, Dr. Pell, are part of it now. The room shifted, the walls bending inward as if the ship itself was breathing. The hum reached a fever pitch, and Margot realized with a sinking dread that Decker was right. The Vanguard was no rescue vessel. It was a trap. Margot grabbed Decker's arm. We have to get out of here. He nodded, and they bolted down the corridor, the floor rippling beneath their feet. The ship twisted around them, corridors elongating and collapsing in impossible patterns. Where are we even going? Decker shouted. To the bridge, Margot replied. If this thing is alive, maybe we can take control. They burst into the bridge, a cavernous chamber filled with consoles and monitors. The crew, Greaves and his identical attendants, stood motionless, their faces blank and their bodies flickering like broken projections. Margot ran to the central console, her fingers flying over the controls. There has to be a way to sever its connection to the abyss. If we can isolate its core systems. A guttural laugh echoed through the chamber, cutting her off. The monitors flickered to life, displaying the entity's fragmented form. Its tendrils writhed, coiling into shapes that resembled mouths and eyes. You cannot escape me, Margot. Decker raised his weapon, firing at the monitors, but the entity's image only multiplied. Its voice deepened, reverberating through the chamber. You are already mine. Margot's mind raced. The entity thrived on fear, chaos, and despair. It used the abyss as a mirror, amplifying the emotions of those trapped within. If she could disrupt that reflection, if she could deny it the fuel it needed to grow, she might weaken its grip. She turned to Decker, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her. We need to confront it together. No fear, no hesitation. Decker stared at her, his jaw clenched. That's insane. It's the only way, Margot insisted. If we let it feed on us, it'll consume everything. But if we reject it, if we take back control of ourselves, it loses its power. The entity's tendrils began to seep into the bridge, coiling around the consoles and filling the air with a suffocating darkness. Margot stepped forward, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. You don't own me, she said, her voice rising. You don't define me. I am more than my fear, more than my pain. The entity laughed, a sound that shook the walls. You are nothing without me. You are fractured, weak, broken. Asterisk, asterisk. Margot closed her eyes, drawing a deep breath. Maybe I am, but that's what makes me human. And I'd rather be human than whatever you are. Decker stepped up beside her, his expression hardening. She's right. You might be powerful, but you're not alive. You're just noise. A parasite. The entity screamed, its tendrils lashing out violently. But the room began to change. The darkness receded, replaced by blinding light. The monitors shattered, and the walls of the bridge cracked, revealing the infinite void of the abyss. Margot felt herself being pulled into the light, her body weightless, her mind free. When she opened her eyes, she was floating in space, the stars bright and clear. The Vanguard was gone, along with the entity and the remnants of the Elysium Array. Decker was beside her, his expression one of quiet awe. Where are we? He asked. Margot smiled faintly. Free. They drifted for what felt like eternity, their bodies untouched by the cold vacuum of space. The stars seemed closer now, their light warm and welcoming. Margot felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The entity was gone, its hold over her broken. And though the scars of the abyss would remain, she knew they had won. Not by fighting, not by running, but by choosing to face the darkness and refusing to let it define them.